My husband works at the Supreme Court, I said, sipping my coffee as Karen waved a case in my face like she was an actual judge. And trust me, you're about to find out exactly how badly you messed up. The look on her face was the exact moment she realized she'd targeted the wrong treehouse and the wrong woman. It started out as one of those perfect weekends you think only exists in commercials, the kind where the sun filters through the trees just right and the only sound you hear is the laughter of children playing outside. My husband, Darren, and I had been working for months on a surprise for our daughter, Lily, a 2-story treehouse complete with rope bridges, climbing walls, and even a small telescope tower. It was part woodland playground, part hideaway, part fairy tale come to life. We hired a licensed builder and made sure everything was safe, sturdy, and within our property boundaries. For Lily, it was magical. For us, it was fun. For Karen, it was clearly the end of the world. We live in a gated community with a homeowners association, which seems like a great idea until you meet Karen, the HOA president, who runs the neighborhood like a cross between a dictator and a high school mean girl. Her hobbies include measuring grass blades with a ruler, issuing citations for unsightly trash, and her favorite sport is finding reasons to harass families she doesn't like. We hadn't even made it 48 hours after the premiere of The Great Treehouse before she showed up at our door in her usual uniform, sun visor, clipboard, and a smirk you could spot from orbit. She didn't knock. She didn't ring the bell. She just stood there with her arms crossed, as if the sight of her was invitation enough. I opened the door and she immediately launched into a dramatic monologue that would have earned her a daytime Emmy. According to Karen, the treehouse violated uniform standards for visual appearance, exceeded the maximum height limit by 1.5 inches, and, most hilariously, threatened the privacy of adjacent properties. Remember, it faced nothing but trees and our backyard. But in Karen's world, children playing meant dangerous supervision. I tried to stay calm, I really did, but when she said we had 48 hours to remove it or face HOA fines and legal action, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. She really thought she was doing us a favor by offering to drop the citation if we voluntarily removed the structure. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "We'll take the risk." Her smile froze. That was not the answer she was expecting. She walked away without another word, and I swear I saw her drafting the lawsuit on her tablet before she even got to the sidewalk. The next day, an envelope slid under our front door with all the drama of a villain's business card. It was an official cease and desist order from the HOA attorney, complete with threats of subpoenas, debts, and even language suggesting that we could be held liable for any injuries caused by the treehouse, even to trespassers. It was over the top, laughable, and a little scary. That's when Darren, who had been quietly observing the madness, stood up, took the envelope, and said, "Time to play the long game." Let me explain something about my husband. Darren is quiet, calm, and patient, qualities that make him an incredible Supreme Court clerk and an even better person to have around during a storm. While Karen and her small HOA army were throwing threats, Darren was studying HOA rules, compiling every email we received, and scanning meeting minutes from 10 years ago. He didn't talk much, he just worked, and when I asked him if he should call a lawyer, he just smiled and said, "Let's give them enough rope first." Meanwhile, I decided to play a PR game. I invited the parents of all the neighborhood kids who had fallen in love with the treehouse to come over and show them how safe and secure it was. I gave them lemonade, let their kids climb it, and then casually broke the news that Karen was trying to tear it down. The reaction was priceless. One dad laughed so hard he almost dropped his drink. Another mom actually asked if she could write a character statement if the case went to court. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, and Karen, despite her showboating, had no idea it was coming. But then things escalated. Flyers began appearing around the neighborhood, warning residents that an illegal structure on the property posed a risk of injury and devalued nearby homes. They were unsigned, but they reeked of desperate perfume and Karen's overuse of capital letters. One even had a blurry photo of our treehouse printed next to a stock photo of a child falling off a ladder. It was laughably bad propaganda, but effective enough that a few concerned neighbors began to ask questions. Darren suggested we stay calm and let Karen dig deeper, and oh my God, she did. A week later, she filed a formal complaint with HOA court. Yes, that's a thing, saying that we had intentionally violated community bylaws and that our defiance had set a dangerous precedent. She attached aerial photos taken from who knows where and declared our treehouse a beacon of recklessness. I nearly spit out my coffee when I read that. We didn't respond right away, though. We let it fester, let her confidence peak, let her think she had won. Then, one morning, I called an emergency HOA meeting. Karen was the first to show up, cocky and ready. She carried a folder of documents and even wore a blazer. She walked in like Judge Judy. But this time, we had our own arsenal. I walked in with Darren by my side and a thick folder under my arm. I let Karen speak first. She gave a long speech about rules and discipline, throwing in words like egregious and irresponsible community behavior. The board nodded in agreement until I spoke up. I calmly presented our evidence, the permits, the details of the licensed contractor, the fact that the rules didn't say a word about backyard recreational structures unless they were permanent residences. Then I pulled out the HOA handbook, the original with Darren's sticky notes all over it, and showed the board how Karen had made up the rules, skipped votes, and held private meetings without anyone's permission. When I finished, I said, "You're not looking at a violation, you're looking at harassment." The room fell silent. Karen looked stunned. Darren stood up, adjusted his tie, and added, "And if this goes any further, we're prepared to take legal action." He pulled out his ID card and placed it gently on the table. It read Clerk, Supreme Court of the United States. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No words came out. She sat down so quickly that the chair creaked. And that's how the real fight began. The next morning, the entire neighborhood was a hive of speculative whispers. People walking their dogs slowed down by our house, some waved more enthusiastically than usual, while others avoided eye contact as if we had built a missile silo instead of a treehouse. But what they didn't know was that Darren barely slept that night. While I dozed off around midnight, he stayed up reading the HOA's bylaws, squinting at passages that hadn't seen the light of day since the 90s. He found something at 3 a.m. that made him mumble, "This is better than I expected." I'd never seen him look so happy reading legal documents. By breakfast, he had flagged every inconsistency in their governing documents and circled what he called the smoking gavel, the fact that the HOA's current board had failed to follow proper procedure in over 2 years. Not a single election had been held since Karen appointed herself president after the last man moved to Arizona. By their own rules, her presidency was not only illegal but technically void. Every decision she'd made since then, including fines, citations, and new restrictions, could be overturned by a competent legal challenge. Darren's words, not mine. He copied everything, formatted it as a summary, and stuffed it into a slim folder labeled Karen versus Common Sense. It was funny, but it also felt like a declaration of war. I spent the day collecting testimony from neighbors. I knocked on doors, not to cause trouble, but to ask questions. Did they know about Karen's emergency meetings? Were they invited? Had they ever voted on the new rules? The answers were almost always the same: confused looks, awkward pauses, and finally a quiet, "Wait, no, I don't think we ever voted on that." It was gold. One neighbor, an elderly Mr. Pennington, told me he had served on the board before Karen took over. He remembered the rules being changed at her kitchen table without the required 5-member vote. "She just told us it was a matter of time and pushed us through," he said, shaking his head. At the time, I thought she was just being efficient. Now I'm starting to wonder. Darren and I compiled all of this into what we called an HOA audit package: every inconsistency, every code violation, every missed election and quorum. But we knew that confronting Karen directly wouldn't work. She thrived on noise, chaos, and confrontation. So we took a different route. We filed a formal complaint with the county's Housing and Neighborhood Compliance Board, quietly and anonymously. Darren made sure the language was precise, unemotional, and backed up with quotes from their own documents. It was surgical. If Karen was expecting a street fight, she had no idea we were coming with snipers. While waiting for the county to respond, Darren also reached out to an old college friend who happens to be a freelance investigative journalist. She has a particular interest in rebellious HOAs and published a viral series 2 years ago called Bullies in the Boardroom. When Darren told her about the Treehouse and Karen's campaign against it, she was immediately intrigued. It sounded like another small-town Napoleon with a badge and a clipboard, she said. Within 2 days, she was driving into town with a notebook, a camera, and a thirst for notoriety. We didn't even have to tell her much. As she started asking questions, the stories came flooding back. One family claimed Karen had fined them for putting a trampoline in their yard, even though the rules had no restrictions on trampolines. Another family swore that Karen had entered their backyard without permission to check out a suspicious shed. A woman said Karen tried to fine her for planting tomatoes in her front garden, citing a non-existent ornamental plant-only policy. It was like a greatest hits compilation of petty abuses of power. The journalist, named Erica, dug into the HOA's financial records next. She requested the annual budget, dues reports, and contractor invoices. The board of directors initially objected, of course, claiming confidentiality, but when Erica mentioned the words freedom of information request and featured article, the doors opened faster than you can say, public shaming. What she found was even better than we could have imagined. Karen approved spending on secret board meetings, high-end office furniture, and repeated consulting fees for a company that didn't even have a functioning website. Erica looked up from her laptop and said, "I think this woman might be stealing from her own neighbors." It was around this time that Karen started to panic. She showed up at our door again, this time without the clipboard or the smug smile. She tried to be nice, saying that she might have overreacted and that maybe the treehouse could be legalized after all. She even said that her threat to sue was just a scare tactic. That's when I realized that she wasn't just worried about the treehouse, she was scared of what we would do next. I thanked her politely and said we were still considering our options. She left with a fake smile that barely held its shape. But 2 hours later, every mailbox in the neighborhood received another flyer. This time, it accused certain residents of trying to undermine the power of the HOA and destabilize the safety of the neighborhood. She didn't name us, but the suggestion was as clear as a brick thrown through a window. That's when we knew she wasn't going to go away quietly. Darren called a local HOA litigation attorney, not because we needed him right away, but because we wanted someone on our side in case things escalated further. The attorney reviewed everything we had and whistled at the end. "This isn't just grounds for eviction. If what you've shown me is accurate, this could end up with criminal charges." That wasn't our goal, but we weren't going to stop the train once it started moving. Meanwhile, Erica continued to dig and eventually confronted Karen outside the HOA office, with cameras rolling. Karen tried to cover her face, then accused Erica of harassment, then rushed to her car, knocking over a sprinkler in the process. The footage not only appeared in Erica's report, it went viral. Within hours of her posting a teaser online with the headline, "HOA President Breaks Down Over Treehouse," the story suddenly wasn't local anymore. And sure enough, the county board called us. They were conducting a formal investigation into the HOA's governance practices. An inspector would arrive the following week. Karen's empire, built on silence and intimidation, began to crumble brick by brick. The treehouse still stood tall in our backyard. Lily had painted a sign that read "Fortress of Justice" and hung it with string. We hadn't taken it down, and now we knew we never would. What had started as a gift for our daughter was becoming something else. A symbol not just of childhood joy, but of what happens when you stand up to a bully with a clipboard and expose the cracks in their little kingdom. And something told me we were just getting started. The lawsuit arrived exactly 2 days after the county announced its investigation. It was almost as if Karen knew the walls were closing in and decided to launch a last-ditch missile in hopes of distracting everyone from the fire that had spread through her office. The envelope arrived via courier, hand-delivered to our front door like it was some kind of royal declaration. I opened it, skimmed the pages, and immediately burst into laughter. Darren didn't laugh. He read the entire thing in complete silence, then carefully put it down, looked up at me, and said, "Well, she just handed us a win." Karen's civil complaint accused us of creating a public hazard, violating aesthetic standards, devaluing the neighborhood's property values, and, in a laughable stretch, contributing to the emotional distress of other homeowners. It was filled with exaggerations, half-truths, and even a few outright lies, such as claiming that our treehouse had flashing lights and played music after midnight, which was physically impossible because the treehouse had no speakers or electricity. But the most amazing part was when she included a handwritten list of names she claimed to support. Darren checked those names against meeting sign-ups and found that half of them hadn't attended a meeting in over a year. We didn't panic, we didn't scream. We just got to work. Darren enlisted the help of his former mentor, a brilliant attorney named Marissa Cole, who now specializes in civil litigation and HOA corruption. Marissa wasn't just sharp, she was brutal in the courtroom, known for dismantling complacent HOA presidents with the efficiency of a wood chipper. She owed Darren a favor from her clerkship days, and when she heard about what was going on, she said, "I've been waiting for someone like Karen." I'm in. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Marissa arrived with a paralegal and a thick folder of motions and evidence. She wanted to countersue, not just to defend us, but to expose the abuse of power, misappropriation of HOA funds, and systemic violations that Karen had committed since taking over. It was bold, decisive, and exactly what we needed. Darren helped craft the legal argument, citing obscure housing laws and constitutional principles like it was second nature. It was thrilling to watch them at work, two legal titans building a case not just to win, but to right a wrong. When the day of the trial arrived, there was standing room only. Word had spread like wildfire. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and even a few law students who had heard about the Treehouse trial from Erica's viral post. Karen showed up in a navy blue suit and pants, carrying a thick folder and a smile that looked like it was plastered on her face. Her lawyer, a man who looked like he regretted every life choice that had led him to this point, whispered something to her, but she ignored him and walked up to the plaintiff's table like she owned the building. We sat in silence. Marissa did most of the talking, and when the judge called the court to order, she stood with a calm, steely confidence that made everyone lean forward. Karen's attorney led the way with a lengthy statement about community standards and neighborhood harmony. He tried to paint us as reckless homeowners, determined to disrupt the peace. He even tried to argue that the treehouse was a safety risk for children who might be tempted to climb it without supervision, despite the fact that it was built with a locked ladder gate and clearly posted rules. It was desperate and weak. Marissa then stood up, walked to the center of the room, and gave what I can only describe as a forensic dissection. She presented photographs, building permits, expert statements from the builder, and evidence of the structural integrity of the treehouse. She exposed the lack of due process in Karen's leadership, pointed out that rules had not been followed for 2 years, and even presented HOA financial records obtained through a Freedom of Information request. Records that showed tens of thousands of dollars had been spent under Karen's authority without documentation or a vote of approval. Then came coup de grace. Marissa pulled out a printout of Erica's article and declared, "This story includes testimony from no fewer than 7 residents who have been improperly fined, harassed, or misled by the plaintiff." Karen naturally objected, saying that the article was hearsay, but the judge dismissed it, noting that the affidavits were attached. The entire courtroom felt like it was leaning toward a verdict. Karen tried to speak up. She insisted that she was only doing what was best for the community, that her intentions were pure, and that she never meant for this to be hostile. The judge raised his hand and asked a simple question. Can you show any documentation that the HOA has voted to approve any of the policies you have implemented since 2022? Karen stammered, looked through her file, and then admitted that no, she didn't have that document in hand. The judge stared at her for a long moment before saying, "Then it appears we have a serious governance problem on top of a misdirected lawsuit." The verdict came 2 hours later. The court dismissed the HOA's case with prejudice, citing lack of standing and abuse of process. Our countersuit was cleared to proceed, and the judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking the HOA from imposing any new fines, penalties, or rule changes until the county's investigation was complete. Karen's face turned the color of spoiled yogurt. But it wasn't over. The next morning, Erica published a follow-up article titled "The Treehouse That Toppled a Tyrant." It included new revelations, emails from Karen to the HOA board that detailed personal expenses, including catered lunches, spa reimbursements, and a conference trip to Las Vegas that coincided with a Taylor Swift concert. The receipts were there, and the fallout was immediate. The article was picked up by a national website. Local radio hosts mocked it. Memes exploded. Someone even photoshopped Karen's face onto the Wicked Witch of the West with a treehouse falling on her. Karen tried to contain the damage, releasing a statement through the HOA's Facebook page calling it all a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled residents, but it was too late. The community that had once tolerated her out of fear now saw her as a vindictive con artist. Meanwhile, our daughter Lily hung a banner from her treehouse that read, "We won." Kids came to play again. Parents smiled as they walked by. The air felt lighter, fresher. For the first time in a long time, our backyard no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like home. Darren and I sat on the deck that night, watching Lily swing down the zipline, her laughter ringing in the air. I turned to him and asked, "Do you think it's really over?" He smiled and said, "Not yet." But the tide had turned. She'd made the mistake of trying to play judge. Now she'd know what happens when the law backs down. And in the distance, Karen's carefully constructed empire of rules, fines, and fabricated power began to crumble like a sandcastle in a high tide. The next few days felt like the slow unraveling of an old rug, revealing how much dirt had been swept under it. Karen had always acted like the queen of the neighborhood, but now her court was in full retreat. Board members who had once proudly stood behind her began to resign without a word. Announcements were quietly removed from the community bulletin board, and the once punctual HOA newsletter no longer appeared. But the silence was louder than anything Karen had ever shouted over her powerful megaphone. She had not only lost control, she had lost the illusion of it. The court order stripped Karen of her ability to impose any new rules, which meant no more fines, no more surprise inspections, and no more last-minute policy changes disguised as safety measures. Her influence was evaporating in real time, and the only thing holding the HOA together was the rope of fear she had tied over the years. Once it snapped, the whole thing would collapse. And it did collapse beautifully. The County Compliance Board began its formal audit. Investigators showed up with clipboards and neutral expressions, taking pictures, recording interviews, and collecting boxes of old HOA records. They weren't interested in Karen's excuses, only in the facts, and the facts weren't kind to her. Neighbors began to talk more freely. At first it was just whispers with wary glances over their shoulders, but soon it became backyard chats, group text messages, and then full-blown public discussions at the local coffee shop. People were tired of living under the rule of an HOA that felt more like a personal empire than a homeowners organization. Stories surfaced of fines for hanging holiday lights for more than a day, threats for kids drawing chalk on the sidewalk, and even someone getting a warning letter because their lawn furniture was the wrong shade of beige. One neighbor said Karen once threatened to call animal control because their dog barked during her meditation. It was ridiculous, but the worst part was how normal it all became under her rule. Darren and I didn't gloat or go public. We knew better than to let the facts speak for themselves. But we continued to move forward with Marissa representing us. We pushed the countersuit not because we wanted the money, but because the community deserved to see the full extent of what Karen had done. If we settled, it would go away quietly, but if we pursued it, we might be forced to be transparent. The discovery was brutal. Her personal purchases with HLA funds amounted to more than $40,000, spa treatments labeled as board wellness, first-class flights listed as conference travel, and even an odd expense labeled as resort snacks. That was actually dinner served at her niece's birthday party. Darren kept every receipt. When Marissa filed a financial misconduct complaint as part of the civil suit, the district attorney's office took notice. That's when things went from a small neighborhood affair to something criminal. Karen's behavior wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. She had mixed personal and HOA funds, created fake vendor invoices, and approved her own reimbursements without a co-signature. The audit confirmed it. The compliance board referred the case to the district attorney, and Karen received a letter saying a formal investigation into financial mismanagement had been opened. The community buzzed like a live wire. People stopped wondering if she was going to be removed and started wondering when she would be caught. Karen went into full swing mode. She called a last-minute community meeting at the club, trying to sway public opinion. She showed up with cookies, soft jazz playing in the background, and a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Restoring Trust." The sarcasm was so thick I almost choked. She tried to frame it all as a misunderstanding. She claimed the trips were for training, the spa visits were therapeutic recovery, and the fines she handed out were for the good of the neighborhood. But no one believed her anymore. Her charm had worn off, and there was no authority behind her words. Her voice just sounded desperate. During the Q&A, an older woman who had lived there since the neighborhood was built raised her hand. She stood up slowly and said, "Karen, I've supported you for years. I even defended you to my friends. But I looked over the rules last night and realized I was defending someone who lied to all of us." Karen froze. You could feel the tension in the air. That one sentence had done more damage than any lawsuit. The room was silent for a long moment before people began to mumble. Some stood up and walked out. Karen was left standing in front of her slideshow, the projector humming behind her, alone. Journalist Erica returned for a follow-up interview. She met with more residents, some too scared to speak out for the first time. She collected videos of Karen screaming at people from her front porch, emails of passive-aggressive threats, and screenshots of HOA fines issued without evidence. Her second article was even more brutal than the first. It painted a picture of a neighborhood dictator whose downfall was not just driven by greed, but arrogance. By the time it was published, the state had picked it up for a broader review of HOA oversight across multiple counties. Meanwhile, the Treehouse remained untouched, festooned with little decorations from the neighborhood kids who had turned it into a sort of sanctuary. Someone had painted a sign that said "Free Country Zone," and someone else had added a small flag to the roof. The kids didn't care about the rules. They just saw it as a place where they could be safe, laugh, and feel free. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. That weekend, we had another backyard get-together, this time with the full blessing of the neighbors. Parents brought snacks.